Blaise Bernstein was full of promise, creativity, and warmth, the kind of person who lit up a room without even trying. Samuel Woodward, on the other hand, was quiet, isolated, and battling demons no one truly saw. When these two former classmates met one ordinary night in suburban California, no one could have imagined it would end in a brutal murder that shocked the nation. But behind a simple meet-up lay a dark secret, one fueled by hatred, obsession, and a chilling double life that turned Blaise's final moments into a haunting mystery still echoing today. Blaise Bernstein had always stood out, not for loudness, but for brilliance. At just 19 years old, he was already making waves as a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania. He was majoring in psychology, had a talent for writing, and carried a quiet intensity that made people stop and listen. During winter break-in, early January 2018, Blaise returned home to Lake Forest, California. His parents were happy to have him back. The house, once quiet, was again filled with his presence, late-night stories, shared meals, and plans for the future. Everything seemed normal, even perfect. Then, on the evening of January 2nd, Blaise left home unexpectedly. He said he was going out to meet a friend from high school. There was nothing strange about it at first. People often reconnect with old friends over the holidays. Blaise didn't give many details, just a name and a casual goodbye before stepping out into the cool night. It was the last time his family would ever see him alive. When Blaise didn't return home that night, his parents grew worried. He wasn't answering texts or calls. His phone appeared to be off. As hours passed with no sign of him, that worry became panic. The following morning, they contacted the authorities and reported Blaise missing. It didn't take long for the case to draw public attention. Blaise wasn't the kind of kid to vanish without a trace. He was responsible, focused, and deeply connected to his loved ones. His sudden disappearance made no sense. Local police, along with volunteers from the community, launched a massive search. They combed through parks, neighborhoods, trails, and any place Blaise might have gone. Flyers went up all over town. Social media lit up with pleas for help. But despite the urgency, there were no concrete leads. Days passed. Each sunset brought new fear, and each sunrise came without answers. It was as if Blaise had vanished into thin air. As detectives dug into his digital life, they found that the last person Blaise had communicated with was Samuel Woodward, a former classmate from high school. Samuel was quiet, a bit of a loner, and had drifted from most social circles after graduation. Blaise had reached out to him over Snapchat, and they'd agreed to meet that night. When police brought Samuel in for questioning, his story was unsettling. He admitted to picking Blaise up and driving him to Borrego Park, a nearby nature spot. He claimed Blaise got out of the car on his own and walked off into the night. Samuel said he never saw him again. Detectives noted that Samuel was visibly nervous. He kept changing small details, hesitated with his answers, and couldn't explain the scratches on his hands or the dirt under his fingernails. Still, there was no body, no weapon, and no clear evidence of a crime. All they had was a missing boy, a silent phone, and a friend whose story didn't feel right. The puzzle had only just begun, and time was quickly running out. The investigation into Blaise Bernstein's disappearance began to narrow in focus. After learning that Samuel Woodward had been the last person to see Blaise, detectives zeroed in on him. His behavior during the initial interview had set off alarms. He appeared anxious and fidgety, and his version of events lacked consistency. He claimed to have driven Blaise to Borrego Park late that night, saying they sat in the car for a while before Blaise got out and walked into the dark alone. Samuel said he waited briefly, then drove home. It seemed strange that Blaise would choose to walk through a deserted park at night, especially without contacting anyone afterward. As detectives examined Samuel's car and clothing, they found what looked like minor stains on the seats and a strong cleaning odor inside the vehicle. His hands had scratches that looked fresh, though he dismissed them as minor injuries from a fall. He gave short, vague explanations that only raised more questions. A search of his phone revealed that after leaving the park, he had returned home but then made several short trips in the early morning hours. Investigators suspected that something had happened in the park, but without a body or a clear crime scene, they couldn't move forward with an arrest. Meanwhile, Blaze's family and friends were desperately searching for answers. They continued to post updates online, organize community searches, and hand out missing person flyers across Orange County. The community came together in a way rarely seen, driven by love for Blaze and a shared fear that something terrible had happened. As the days passed with no sign of him, the fear only deepened. Investigators began looking into Samuel's past, trying to understand his personality and lifestyle. They discovered he had become increasingly withdrawn after high school. He didn't appear to have many friends and had isolated himself from most social settings. What alarmed detectives even more was what they began to uncover from Samuel's online activity. Hidden in encrypted folders and anonymous accounts were troubling signs, symbols associated with hate groups, screenshots of violent online conversations, and forums dedicated to extremist ideology. It painted a picture of someone who had drifted into dangerous territory. The more they learned, the more investigators questioned the idea that Blaze's disappearance was random. Could this have been a targeted attack? Was Samuel hiding something much darker? While this new information provided a chilling motive, police still lacked the physical evidence to tie him to any crime. All they had was suspicion, odd behavior, and digital traces of a disturbed mind. Then, on January 9th, everything changed. A hiker walking through Borrego Park noticed something unusual: freshly turned soil in a secluded spot not far from a trail. He alerted authorities. Within hours, crime scene investigators arrived and carefully began excavating the area. What they found confirmed their worst fears. Blaze Bernstein had been buried in a shallow grave, just steps from where Samuel claimed to have dropped him off. The search for a missing boy had just become a murder investigation. The discovery of Blaze Bernstein's body brought a cold silence to the community. It was a moment no one wanted to believe. For days, there had been hope, faint and fragile, that maybe Blaze was still alive somewhere, just lost or hiding. But when the forensic team pulled his body from the shallow grave in Borrego Park, that hope disappeared. Blaze had been stabbed more than 20 times. The sheer brutality of the crime suggested rage, possibly even hatred. His remains had been hidden just beneath the surface in a patch of disturbed dirt that had gone unnoticed for nearly a week. The grave was shallow, rushed, and poorly covered, as if someone had been panicked during the act. Soil had been unevenly piled back over his body, and nearby brush had been hastily moved to conceal the site. There was no attempt to move him far from the park, no elaborate effort to erase the evidence. It was crude and desperate. But it was enough for investigators to know one thing with certainty: this wasn't an accident. Blaze had been murdered, and his killer hadn't gone far afterward. As the body was examined, detectives began piecing together a clearer timeline. Blaze had likely been killed the same night he vanished, January 2nd. The location of the grave was just a few yards from where Samuel Woodward said he last saw him. It was too much of a coincidence. Investigators brought Samuel back in for further questioning, this time not as a witness, but as a suspect. They pressed him about the inconsistencies in his story, the late-night drives, the physical evidence, and now, the proximity of the burial site. Samuel stuck to his original version but showed signs of strain. He couldn't explain the timeline. He couldn't account for his behavior. He had no convincing reason why he hadn't contacted anyone after Blaze supposedly walked into the darkness alone. At the same time, forensic scientists began testing evidence from Samuel's car and clothing. Small traces of blood were found, and DNA analysis confirmed it belonged to Blaze. Soil samples taken from the vehicle matched those from the grave site. Even the scratches on Samuel's hands, which he had claimed were from a fall, appeared consistent with wounds from a struggle or handling rough terrain. Piece by piece, the puzzle was beginning to take shape. While the public now knew Blaze had been killed, what remained unclear was why. What had happened between Blaze and Samuel that night? Why would someone murder a former classmate with such violence? And why bury him so close to where they had supposedly parted ways? The questions grew heavier as more details came to light. Samuel wasn't just a former acquaintance. He had a dark, hidden side that no one seemed to have fully understood. Behind the quiet exterior was a young man steeped in hate, paranoia, and isolation. And whatever happened that night in Borrego Park, it wasn't random. It was personal, and it had ended in tragedy. As investigators dug deeper into Samuel Woodward's background, the portrait of a troubled young man became disturbingly clear. On the surface, Samuel had been just another quiet high school graduate, socially awkward, a little withdrawn, but seemingly harmless. Underneath, however, he was living a far more sinister reality. The search of his home uncovered a series of personal journals, online activity, and images that pointed to an obsession with violence and hatred. Tucked between handwritten entries were rants filled with aggressive, hateful language directed at multiple groups. Among them were repeated references to the LGBTQ+ community and Jewish individuals. Forensic experts began analyzing the contents of his devices. Investigators found encrypted messages exchanged with online communities known for white supremacist ideologies. These groups operated in the shadows of the internet, hiding behind usernames and coded language, yet their influence on Samuel was now undeniable. He had been actively engaging with these groups for months, possibly years, and his communications suggested not only admiration for extremist figures but also a desire to carry out violence himself. Samuel's writings revealed chilling thoughts. He spoke of feeling superior to others and wanting to cleanse society of what he considered weakness. What was most disturbing was how specific some of these entries were. Certain phrases matched the circumstances of Blaze's death: a stabbing, a remote location, and the calculated concealment of a body. It wasn't just a journal. It was a blueprint. With this evidence, authorities were now convinced the murder was not just a result of a personal argument or emotional outburst. It was driven by ideology. Blaze, a proud, openly gay, Jewish young man, may have been targeted precisely for who he was. The case, already horrifying, now carried the weight of a hate crime. Prosecutors quickly added this charge alongside the murder indictment, setting the stage for a more complex legal battle. The community, already devastated by Blaze's death, now had to come to terms with the fact that such extremism had existed right in their midst. Samuel hadn't lived in isolation. He had attended local schools, walked the same streets, and sat in the same classrooms. But somehow, he had slipped into a world of radical beliefs without detection. The case raised questions about how hate grows in silence and how easily it can go unnoticed until it turns into something irreversible. Blaze's family, though shattered by grief, began to speak out. They were determined not to let his story fade into another tragic statistic. Their son had been killed by hate, and they wanted the world to know what that looked like. They spoke about Blaze's kindness, his humor, his dreams. He had been more than a victim, he had been a young man with a future. The trial had yet to begin, but the evidence was damning. And as the media picked up the story, Blaze Bernstein's murder began to represent something larger. It was no longer just about one victim and one killer. It became a reminder that hate, when left unchecked, can lead to something far more terrifying than words. As the legal process unfolded, the case against Samuel Woodward dragged on longer than anyone expected. Court dates were delayed, attorneys filed motions, and questions around Samuel's mental health became a central issue. His defense team argued that he was mentally unstable, suggesting he suffered from serious psychological conditions that impaired his judgment the night Blaze Bernstein was killed. They painted a picture of a young man battling internal chaos, socially isolated, and unable to connect with others in a meaningful way. But prosecutors weren't convinced that mental illness explained everything. They pointed to his journals, the online activity, the methodical nature of the crime. All of it suggested premeditation, not confusion. The community watched closely as every detail emerged. What had started as a local missing person case had now become a national story, amplified by the social and political undertones surrounding it. Blaze's identity, being gay, Jewish, and outspoken, was at the heart of the discussion. His death sparked conversations about the rise of hate crimes in America and the dangers of radicalization. Public reaction was a mix of sorrow and outrage. People wanted justice, but they also wanted answers. How had someone like Samuel, seemingly just another face in the crowd, become capable of something so brutal while the court system moved slowly? Blaze's family moved with purpose. They channeled their grief into action, launching the Blaze Bernstein Foundation. Its mission was simple but powerful: to spread kindness, support vulnerable youth, and combat hate in all its forms. They visited schools, held community events, and worked with organizations that focused on tolerance and inclusion. Blaze's parents became advocates, not just for their son, but for countless others who might one day find themselves in harm's way simply for being different. For those who knew Blaze, the pain didn't fade. Friends remembered his clever jokes, his thoughtful advice, his talent for writing, and his love of food and conversation. He had plans: graduate school, travel, a future filled with possibility. All of it was stolen in a single night, not by a stranger, but by someone he once knew. The betrayal made it all the more difficult to accept. Years later, the trial remained unresolved, tangled in legal delays and debates over competency. But the evidence remained clear, and so did the motive. It was a case built on hate, a crime that shocked not only because of its violence, but because of its purpose. Blaze hadn't just been murdered, he had been silenced for the very things that made him unique. In the end, the story of Blaze Bernstein became more than a headline. It became a symbol of what can happen when hate goes unchallenged and when silence replaces empathy. His life, though short, ignited a movement that continues to fight back against the very forces that ended it. The world lost Blaze, but through the voices that rose in his memory, his legacy continues to grow, one act of courage, kindness, and truth at a time.